Along with the loud fans, the staff who smoked were significantly outnumbered by patients, making the smoke rooms the most dangerous areas in the facility. However, as with most of the staff that smoked, Cassie did some of her best counseling in those rooms because the people who share bad habits also bond over them. Now it's time for Puppets, Pupils, and Producers, a story of mind over matter. When Cassie was a kid, 50% of Canadians over the age of 15 smoked cigarettes wherever they wanted. They smoked in cars, in buses, and on airplanes. They smoked in their home, in restaurants, at their job, and during recreational activities such as going to the movies. When Cassie started working at the facility, the vast majority of patients and inmates, and at least half of the staff, smoked. So regardless of whether you put a cigarette to your lips or not, you had no choice but to inhale the thick smog that filled the institution. On the bad side, matches and lighters were contraband, so the inmates had to light their cigarettes at hot spots, which were similar to the lighters found in cars years ago. However, hotspots were only located in the common areas and in the yards because the inmates were not allowed to smoke in their cells. On the mad side, the patients could smoke in their cells, but they were not provided with matches or a lighter. As a result, the staff were constantly being asked, which was relatively innocuous during the day when the lights are on, but startling during the night when the staff would stealthily approach a dimly lit cell, but wouldn't be able to see in because the patient was standing a cigarette length away, waiting for a light.
Hey, Cassie, got a light?
Regardless of which unit a patient was housed on, their addiction to tobacco was enabled and used as a tool to motivate or diffuse. While one might think the small percentage of non-smoking patients would be the duly diagnosed because they had the emotional and mental capabilities of a child, the unfortunate truth was that they all smoked without understanding the risks or addictiveness because they were in a behavior therapy program which used cigarettes as a reward. If a patient had his own money, he could purchase filtered cigarettes known as tailor-mades or TMs at the canteen. If he didn't have his own money, he was provided with one bale of tobacco and one package of rolling papers each week. In the 1970s, research revealed the detrimental effects of secondhand smoke, but it didn't really become a thing for another 20 years. At that time, smoking was finally banned on all Canadian airlines. However, another decade would pass before enclosed spaces like shopping malls, hospitals, and workplaces would become 100% smoke-free. During that 10-year window, smoking in patient cells came to an end, and it was only allowed outside in the yards and in designated sealed and sunless smoking rooms, where, along with having walls stained by the same nicotine yellow goo, all had very loud exhaust fans that usually squealed from their overuse. As a result, you couldn't hear what was going on outside of a smoke room and vice versa. It wasn't unusual for some of the patients to spend most of their waking hours in the smoke room. Other patients came and went, as did the frontline staff who smoked, because unlike every other employee in the facility, they weren't allowed to go outside for a break or a meal because they were on count, meaning they had to spend every minute of their shift on the unit. Along with the loud fans, the staff who smoked were significantly outnumbered by patients, making the smoke rooms the most dangerous areas in the facility. However, as with most of the staff that smoked, Cassie did some of her best counseling in those rooms because the people who share bad habits also bond over them. Arthur was stuck in the revolving door of the mental health system. When stable, he was a gentle man who promised he'd never stop taking his pills again. But he would, because as with most patients with a major mental illness like schizophrenia, medication compliance was an ongoing issue. When he was unwell, he became paranoid, reactive, and assaultive. Luckily, his attacks thus far were not life-threatening, and he usually responded to treatment quickly. But because he was in the forensic mental health system, he'd automatically return to maximum security when he reoffended. By then, he'd been her patient on 2 of the 3 units she was assigned to over the years, so Cassie was familiar with the unwell and the well versions of Arthur. At that time, his condition had improved, and he was insightful. But that didn't mean she trusted him, because she'd learned the hard way that she couldn't predict the unpredictable. Cassie and Arthur were in the smoke room alone, and as usual, she made sure she was closer to the door. Both of them were laughing about his humorous depiction of his last assault, because regrettably, the random man he'd attacked on a subway platform had a black belt in Taekwondo. He went on to describe how the man took his legs out from under him and had him pinned in a prone position before his fist even made contact. Cassie shared how she'd recently started taking Taekwondo lessons and added she'd watched the black belts spar so she could attest to their amazing skills and speed. Ed was the unit's newest patient, but he'd arrived on their day off, so no one on her team knew him yet. What they did know was that he was found not guilty by reason of insanity for attempting to murder his landlord, because he believed he was sneaking into his apartment during the night to sodomize him in his sleep. When Ed entered the smoke room, he ignored Arthur and Cassie, and after he lit an inch-long cigarette butt on the hot spot, he sat down between her and the door. Cassie introduced herself as a nurse on the unit and politely asked him to move to the bench across from her. But he refused, and in an angry tone, he said he didn't take orders from bitches. Before she could respond, Arthur ran interference and offered Ed one of his cigarettes, which caused him to get up and move away from the door. Cassie took advantage of Arthur's distraction and made her exit. Once the door was closed, Arthur suggested that Ed reconsider his attitude because he'd been around, and in his opinion, he was in the best hospital in the province, and Cassie was one of the best nurses in the place. Then, instead of telling the true version, he retold the story of his latest assault, except this time Cassie was the one with the black belt in Taekwondo, and instead of being the attacker, Arthur was the witness who watched her go toe-to-toe with one of the toughest patients in the facility, which was also based on a real event, except Cassie definitely didn't win that fight. As usual, Arthur's mental status improved and arrangements were made for his transfer to a medium secure facility. A month before he left, Arthur told Cassie he was going to quit smoking and challenged her to join him. She accepted, not because of the risks to her health, but because she didn't want her children to smoke and knew that do as I say and not as I do didn't work. Cassie thought about quitting, but oftentimes she found a reason to delay it. She'd tell herself she didn't want to gain weight, or she'd point to an upcoming holiday and decide she didn't want to ruin it by being irritable and preoccupied with cravings. Other times she tried quitting cold turkey, but she failed. The next time she also focused on changing her routines and environment, but it didn't work either. Then she tried gradually cutting down and timing the intervals between cigarettes. When nicotine replacement became available, she tried the patch and then the gum, but nothing lasted. Of all her bad habits, smoking had the strongest hold on her. It became her nemesis because her desire to quit was strong, but her desire to smoke was stronger. To her credit, she didn't stop trying, and instead of criticizing herself for a lack of willpower, she started wondering why others could quit, but she couldn't. Since everyone in her immediate family smoked, she questioned whether it was genetic, but that theory didn't make sense because there were plenty of non-smokers throughout her extended family. Then she considered that since she'd been exposed to cigarette smoke before birth and had spent her childhood inhaling her parents' secondhand smoke, she was addicted to nicotine long before she consciously chose to smoke herself. Which did make sense to her because as a child, she'd hated her parents' smoking and swore she'd never do it. Yet she started anyways. Then she thought about why she started in the first place. And although she couldn't deny that Rich's encouragement played a role, she couldn't ignore that she'd smoked plenty of cigarettes with her friend Connie when they were only 9 years old. What she didn't consider was the ACE framework and research linking childhood trauma to smoking, because at the time, the research had just been published. So the idea that her ACE score was 9 out of 10, and that people with a score of 5 and above were 3 times more likely to smoke and 5 times more likely to start smoking early, was not something she was privy to. Had she read the recently released research at the time, it would have made sense for her patients, but not for her, because she didn't think her childhood was affecting her state of physical or mental health. Cassie prepared to quit again and told herself that this time she'd succeed, but she failed again because she didn't appreciate that she wasn't just giving up the substance that affected her brain's pain-pleasure balance, but also the one that eased her mind's psychological pain, and the one that calmed the erratic activation of her nervous system, and the one that accompanied her during her disassociation.